The Unseen Prankster's Lament. Chapter 1. The Invisible Discovery. Alex Thompson slouched in his chair, his green eyes fixed on the clock above the blackboard. As the seconds ticked by, he felt the familiar weight of invisibility settling over him. Not literal invisibility, not yet, but the social kind that had become his constant companion. The bell rang, and a flurry of movement erupted around him. Classmates rushed past, their conversations a blur of excitement about weekend plans and after-school activities. No one spared Alex a glance as he gathered his books and slipped into the hallway. "Hey, Sarah," he managed, his voice barely audible over the din as he passed his crush. Sarah, auburn hair catching the fluorescent light, turned slightly. "Oh, hi." She paused, clearly struggling to place him. "Alex, right?" He nodded, a familiar ache blooming in his chest. Even after a year in the same class, he was still forgettable. The pain of being overlooked, of being a mere footnote in others' lives, threatened to overwhelm him. Alex made his way home, kicking at loose pebbles on the sidewalk. The suburban streets were a picture of tranquility, manicured lawns, cookie-cutter houses, and the distant laughter of children playing. It all felt suffocating, a constant reminder of his inability to fit in, to be seen. As he rounded the corner to his street, something caught his eye. Beyond the last row of houses, barely visible through a tangle of overgrown bushes, stood a dilapidated structure he'd never noticed before. Curiosity piqued. Alex veered off the sidewalk. He pushed through the unkempt foliage, thorns catching at his jeans. The building loomed before him, a sprawling concrete monstrosity, its windows boarded up and its chain-link fence rusted and sagging. "What is this place?" he muttered, running a hand through his tousled brown hair. A weathered sign, barely legible beneath years of grime, caught his attention. "Property of U.S. government. No trespassing." Alex's heart raced. A secret government facility right here in suburbia. It was like something out of the sci-fi novels he devoured, a chance for adventure, for something extraordinary in his painfully ordinary life. He found a gap in the fence and squeezed through, wincing as the rusted metal scraped his arm. The front door was locked, but a side window had been carelessly left ajar. With a grunt of effort, Alex pried it open and clambered inside. The interior was a maze of dusty corridors and abandoned rooms, the air thick with the musty scent of decay and forgotten secrets. Outdated equipment lay scattered about, covered in cobwebs. In what must have been a main laboratory, rows of workstations sat in eerie silence, as if their occupants had simply vanished mid-experiment. Alex moved carefully, his sneakers leaving prints in the thick dust. He ran his fingers along the edge of a desk, imagining the secrets that might have been uncovered here. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of his own breathing and the occasional creak of settling concrete. A glint of metal caught his eye. In the far corner of the room, a small safe stood open, its door hanging askew. Inside, nestled on a velvet cushion, was what looked like a high-tech wristwatch. Alex's breath caught in his throat. The device was sleek and futuristic, utterly out of place among the lab's dated equipment. His hand trembled as he reached for it, half expecting alarms to blare or hidden cameras to spring to life. As his fingers closed around the cool metal, a jolt of electricity seemed to run through him. The watch face glowed softly, revealing a complex array of buttons and dials. "What are you?" Alex whispered, turning the device over in his hands. For a moment, he felt truly alive, the thrill of discovery pushing away the constant ache of his social invisibility. His thumb brushed against a prominent button on the side. For a moment, he hesitated, common sense warring with an overwhelming curiosity. The rational part of his mind screamed warnings, but the part of him that yearned to be significant, to matter, urged him on. Curiosity won. Alex pressed the button. The world around him shimmered, like heat waves rising from sun-baked asphalt. He blinked, disoriented. When his vision cleared, everything seemed normal, except... He looked down at his hands, or rather, where his hands should have been. There was nothing there. Alex Thompson had become invisible. A laugh bubbled up from his throat, a mix of disbelief and exhilaration. For a boy who had always felt unseen, the irony wasn't lost on him. Now, he was truly invisible, and for the first time in his life, he felt powerful. As the reality of his situation sank in, a grin spread across Alex's unseen face. The possibilities were endless. No more being overlooked, no more feeling insignificant. With this device, he could go anywhere, see anything, do whatever he wanted. The world was about to see, or rather, not see, a whole new Alex Thompson. As he made his way out of the abandoned lab, his mind raced with plans. The excitement of his newfound power drowned out the small voice of caution in the back of his mind. He failed to notice the small warning label on the back of the device, its text faded but still legible. Caution. Prolonged use may lead to unforeseen consequences. Alex stepped out into the fading afternoon light, invisible to the world, unaware that he had just set in motion a chain of events that would change his life forever. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the suburban landscape, as if nature itself was foreshadowing the darkness to come. Chapter 2. Unseen Mischief. The suburban streets lay quiet in the early evening light as Alex made his way home, his footsteps silent on the sidewalk. He marveled at the sensation of being utterly unseen, a giddy excitement bubbling in his chest. As he approached his house, a wicked grin spread across his invisible face. "Time to have some fun," he whispered to himself. He crept up to his front door, careful not to make a sound. Through the window, he could see his younger sister Emily sprawled on the couch, her eyes glued to her phone. Alex suppressed a chuckle as he slowly turned the doorknob and eased the door open. Emily didn't even look up as he entered. Alex tiptoed across the room, his heart racing with mischievous anticipation. He stood directly behind the couch, leaned in close to Emily's ear and whispered, "Boo!" Emily shrieked, her phone flying from her hands. She whirled around, eyes wide with terror, searching for the source of the voice. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling. Alex bit his lip to keep from laughing out loud. He reached out and tugged gently on a strand of Emily's unruly auburn hair. "Mom, Dad," Emily screamed, leaping off the couch. "There's a ghost in the house." As Emily ran from the room, Alex doubled over with silent laughter. This was going to be more fun than he'd ever imagined. Over the next few days, Alex gradually pushed the boundaries of his newfound power. He started small, sneaking extra cookies from the kitchen without his parents noticing. Then he progressed to more daring exploits, like slipping into movie theaters undetected. One afternoon, he followed his English teacher, Mr. Johnson, into the faculty lounge. Alex's invisible eyes widened as he saw the upcoming test questions pinned to a bulletin board. For a moment he hesitated, his conscience pricking at him, but the allure of effortless success was too strong to resist. He quickly memorized the questions, justifying it to himself as harmless curiosity. As the days passed, Alex found himself drawn more and more to Sarah, his longtime crush. He lingered by her locker, invisible and unnoticed, drinking in the details he'd never had the courage to observe up close, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was thinking, the soft hum she made when reading something interesting. One evening, emboldened by his invisibility, Alex followed Sarah home. He watched from the sidewalk as she entered her house, his heart racing with a mixture of exhilaration and guilt. Before he could stop himself, he was scaling the trellis outside her bedroom window. Alex hesitated on the windowsill, his conscience screaming at him to turn back. But curiosity won out, and he eased the window open, slipping silently into Sarah's room. The space was a revelation. Sketches and paintings covered the walls, revealing an artistic talent Alex had never known Sarah possessed. On her desk, a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird lay open, its margins filled with her neat handwriting. Alex reached out to touch the book, then froze as he heard footsteps approaching. Sarah entered the room, humming softly to herself. Alex pressed himself against the wall, hardly daring to breathe as Sarah moved around her room, completely unaware of his presence. As he watched her, a wave of shame washed over Alex. This wasn't a harmless prank or a victimless crime. He was violating Sarah's privacy, intruding on her personal space. The line between mischief and something far darker suddenly seemed terrifyingly thin. Heart-pounding, Alex slipped out of the window and climbed down, his earlier excitement replaced by a sickening guilt. He hurried home, trying to shake off the feeling of having crossed a line he could never uncross. Later that night, as Alex lay in bed, still invisible, he reflected on his actions. The rush of power he felt was intoxicating, but the voice of his conscience was growing louder, harder to ignore. "It's harmless," he muttered to himself, trying to quiet the voice. "I'm not really hurting anyone." But as he drifted off to sleep, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of a precipice, about to plunge into something he couldn't control. In his dreams, he was visible again, standing before a mirror. But as he watched, his reflection began to fade, becoming transparent, then disappearing entirely. Alex woke with a start, his heart pounding. He fumbled for the invisibility device on his wrist, his fingers searching for the button to turn it off. For a terrifying moment, he couldn't find it. Panic rose in his throat. Finally, his thumb found the switch. He pressed it, and with a shimmer, he became visible once more. Alex let out a shaky breath, relief washing over him. As the adrenaline subsided, Alex stared at the device on his wrist. The power it gave him was exhilarating, but for the first time he felt a flicker of fear. What if he couldn't control it? What if he went too far? He pushed the thought away, but it lingered at the edges of his mind, a shadow he couldn't quite shake. He was in control. He could stop any time he wanted, couldn't he? As dawn broke outside his window, Alex made a half-hearted promise to himself to be more careful. But even as he thought it, he knew the temptation of invisibility would be too strong to resist. The line between right and wrong was blurring, and Alex was losing himself in the intoxicating power of being unseen. Chapter 3. The Invisible Thief. The local convenience store's bell chimed as the door swung open, seemingly of its own accord. Alex slipped inside, his invisible heart racing with a mixture of excitement and guilt. He'd been using his power for small pranks and harmless observation for weeks now. But today was different. Today, he was about to cross a line. He made his way down the snack aisle, eyeing the colourful array of chip bags and candy bars. With a quick glance to ensure no one was watching, he reached out and plucked a chocolate bar from the shelf. The candy hovered in mid-air for a moment before disappearing into his unseen pocket. "Too easy," Alex whispered to himself, a smirk playing on his invisible lips. Emboldened by his success, he moved on to the electronics section. A sleek new smartphone caught his eye, its price tag making him wince. Without hesitation, he unhooked it from its security tether and slipped it into his backpack. As Alex turned to leave, he caught sight of Mr. Patel, the store owner, deep in conversation with a young employee. Their hushed tones piqued his curiosity, and he inched closer to eavesdrop. "I'm sorry, Samantha, but I have no choice," Mr. Patel was saying, his voice heavy with regret. "The inventory numbers aren't adding up, and as the newest employee—" "But Mr. Patel, I swear I haven't taken anything," Samantha protested, her eyes welling with tears. Alex felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He'd seen Samantha around school, a quiet girl from a struggling family who'd been thrilled to land this part-time job. And now, because of his actions, she was being fired for theft she didn't commit. He backed away slowly, guilt clawing at his insides. The stolen items in his pockets and backpack suddenly felt like lead weights. Outside, Alex leaned against the store's wall, his invisible form trembling. He should go back, return the items, confess. But the thought of revealing his secret, of facing consequences, paralyzed him. "It's not my fault," he muttered, trying to convince himself. "I didn't mean for this to happen." But as he watched Samantha exit the store, wiping tears from her eyes, Alex knew he was lying to himself. Over the next few days, Alex's guilt warred with a growing sense of invincibility. He'd gotten away with theft. What else could he do? He found himself pushing boundaries further, sneaking into the local cinema's projection room to watch new releases before anyone else, slipping into the teacher's lounge to read confidential files, even venturing into the locker rooms after gym class to satisfy his curiosity. Each transgression brought a rush of adrenaline, momentarily drowning out the voice of his conscience. But in the quiet moments, usually late at night when he lay awake staring at the ceiling, the weight of his actions pressed down on him. One afternoon, Alex overheard his parents discussing the strange occurrences that had been plaguing the neighborhood. "Did you hear about the break-in at the school?" his mother asked, worry lines creasing her forehead. Nothing was taken, but all the test papers for next week were scattered everywhere. Alex winced, remembering his late-night excursion to peek at the exam questions. "And Mrs. Johnson next door swears someone's been in her house," his father added. "Says she keeps hearing footsteps when she's alone." Alex's face burned with shame. He'd been curious about the inside of Mrs. Johnson's Victorian home, and had taken to wandering through it when she was watching TV. "It's not just here," his mother continued. "The whole neighborhood's on edge. People are installing security systems, forming neighborhood watch groups." As Alex listened to his parents' concerned conversation, the reality of what he'd set in motion began to sink in. His actions weren't happening in a vacuum. They were affecting real people, creating fear and suspicion in a once peaceful community. Later that evening, Alex stood in front of his bathroom mirror, the invisibility device heavy on his wrist. He pressed the button, watching as his reflection shimmered into view. The face that stared back at him was one he hardly recognized, eyes shadowed with guilt, mouth set in a hard line. "I can stop any time I want," he told his reflection. But even as the words left his mouth, his fingers were already moving towards the device, ready to disappear again. As he vanished from sight, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing more than just his visibility. With each transgression, each boundary crossed, he was losing pieces of himself. His integrity, his empathy, his connection to the world around him. The next day, Alex found himself outside the Miller's house. He'd overheard Mr. Miller bragging about his new home theatre system, and curiosity got the better of him. As he slipped through an open window, the thrill of trespassing mingled with a growing sense of unease. He wandered through the house, marveling at the expensive furnishings. In the living room, he found Mrs. Miller sitting alone, staring at a framed photograph. Alex inched closer, curiosity overriding his caution. The photo showed a smiling couple, Mr. and Mrs. Miller, with their arms around a young man in a military uniform. As Alex watched, a tear slid down Mrs. Miller's cheek. "Oh, Tommy," she whispered to the photo, "I miss you so much." Alex felt like he'd been punched in the gut. He was intruding on a deeply personal moment of grief. The realization of how far he'd strayed from his moral compass hit him with full force. He stumbled backwards, knocking over a vase. It shattered on the hardwood floor, and Mrs. Miller's head snapped up, her eyes wide with fear. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. Alex fled, his heart pounding. He ran until he reached the abandoned lab where he'd found the device, his invisible form shaking with sobs. The allure of invisibility, the rush of power it brought, was still strong. But now, it was tinged with a bitter understanding of its cost. As he slipped back into his bedroom that night, Alex told himself that this would be the last time. Just one more adventure, one more secret to uncover, and then he'd stop. He was so caught up in his internal struggle that he failed to notice the slight flicker in the device on his wrist, a momentary glitch that would soon change everything. Chapter 4. Unseen Consequences. The warm glow of sunset painted the suburban streets in hues of orange and gold as Alex, invisible to the world, crept along the side of the Thompson house. His parents' voices drifted through an open window, and he paused, curiosity peaking. "I'm worried about the Millers," his mother was saying, her voice laced with concern. "They've been acting so strangely lately." Alex's father grunted in agreement. "John's been distant at work. Something's definitely off." The Millers. Alex's mind flashed to their house 2 doors down. Mr. Miller worked with his dad, and Mrs. Miller often brought over homemade cookies. Their daughter Lily was in his class. What could be wrong? Without a second thought, Alex changed course. The thrill of uncovering a secret far outweighed any lingering guilt about invading privacy. He'd just take a quick peek, he told himself. No harm done. As he approached the Miller's house, a flicker of movement caught his eye. Through the living room window, he could see Mrs. Miller pacing, phone pressed to her ear. Her face was etched with distress. Alex inched closer, straining to hear. "Can't go on like this, John," Mrs. Miller was saying, her voice trembling. "The lies, the late nights, I found the hotel receipt." Alex's eyes widened. Was Mr. Miller having an affair? I don't know who she is, Mrs. Miller continued, but I can't. She broke off as the front door opened. Mr. Miller walked in, his shoulders slumped. We need to talk, Mrs. Miller said, ending the call. Alex watched, transfixed, as the scene unfolded. Accusations flew, voices raised. Mr. Miller denied everything at first, then crumbled under the weight of evidence. Tears flowed. Promises were made and broken in the same breath. As the argument reached its crescendo, Alex became aware of a presence behind him. He turned to see Lily Miller, frozen on the sidewalk, staring at her house with wide, horrified eyes. She must have just gotten home from soccer practice, Alex realized. She'd heard everything. Lily's backpack slipped from her shoulder, hitting the ground with a thud. The sound seemed to snap her out of her trance. With a choked sob, she turned and ran. Alex stood rooted to the spot, the weight of what he'd witnessed pressing down on him. He'd wanted to uncover a secret, but this was more than he'd bargained for. Over the next few days, Alex watched as the fallout from that night rippled through the community. The Millers put on brave faces in public, but the strain showed in the tight smiles and averted gazes. Lily stopped coming to school, and rumours flew about her parents' impending divorce. At home, Alex's parents spoke in hushed tones about the situation. I just don't understand, his mother said one evening. They always seemed so happy. Alex, invisible in the corner of the room, felt his stomach churn. He understood all too well. He'd been there, an unseen witness to the unravelling of a family. And for what? A moment's thrill? The satisfaction of knowing something others didn't? For the first time, the true weight of his actions began to sink in. His invisibility wasn't just affecting him, it was changing the lives of everyone around him, and not for the better. That night, as he lay in bed, Alex stared at the device on his wrist. The power it gave him was intoxicating, but the price was becoming too high. I should stop, he whispered to the darkness. I need to stop. But even as the words left his mouth, his fingers were already moving towards the button. The familiar rush as he vanished from sight washed over him, momentarily drowning out the voice of his conscience. Just one more time, he told himself. One last adventure, and then he'd put it all behind him. As he slipped out of his window, Alex failed to notice the slight flicker in the device, a momentary glitch that sent a shiver of unease down his spine. Something was changing, shifting beneath the surface. But caught up in the thrill of invisibility, Alex pushed the feeling aside. He had no way of knowing that his next escapade would be his last, and that the consequences would be far more permanent than he could ever have imagined. Alex made his way to the high school, his invisible form slipping effortlessly through the night. The building loomed before him, dark and imposing. He'd overheard the principal mentioning a new security system, and curiosity burned within him. Just one last secret to uncover, then he'd be done with this invisibility business for good. He found an unlocked window and eased it open, slipping inside. The halls were eerily quiet, moonlight casting long shadows across the floor. Alex made his way to the principal's office, his heart racing with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. As he reached for the door handle, the device on his wrist suddenly grew hot. Alex glanced down, alarmed to see it glowing an angry red. Before he could react, a sharp pain shot through his arm. What the? He gasped, but his words were cut short as the world around him began to shimmer and warp. The pain intensified, spreading through his body like liquid fire. Alex tried to scream, but no sound came out. He felt himself being stretched, pulled apart at the seams of reality itself. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. Alex stood in the darkened hallway, panting heavily, but something was terribly wrong. He looked down at his hands, expecting to see them shimmer back into visibility. Instead, there was nothing. Not just invisibility, but a complete absence of form. Panic rising in his throat, Alex lunged for the nearest solid object, a trophy case. His hand passed right through the glass, feeling nothing. No, he whispered, his voice sounding distant and echoing. No, no, no! He rushed to a bathroom, desperate to see his reflection, but the mirror showed only an empty room. Alex was no longer just invisible. He had become intangible, phased out of physical reality itself. The full horror of his situation crashed over him like a tidal wave. He couldn't touch anything, couldn't interact with the world in any way. He was trapped in a limbo between existence and nothingness, a ghost in his own life. Alex tried to scream, to cry, to do anything to prove he still existed, but the world remained oblivious to his presence, unmoved by his despair. As the first light of dawn crept through the windows, Alex realized the terrible truth. His reckless use of power, his disregard for consequences had led him to this. He was truly, utterly alone, unseen, unheard, unfelt by the world he had taken for granted. The invisibility he had once craved had become his prison, and the key was lost forever. Alex Thompson, once a mischievous teenager, now a phantom observer, faced an eternity of watching life unfold around him, unable to participate, unable to be seen or heard, a cautionary tale in the dangers of unchecked power and the true meaning of invisibility. Chapter 5. The Point of No Return. The moonlight cast long shadows across the empty parking lot of Millbrook High School as Alex approached, his invisible form nothing more than a slight disturbance in the night air. His heart raced with a potent mixture of anticipation and fear. This was it, his most daring exploit yet. Just one more time, he whispered to himself, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. Then I'm done. He'd repeated this promise to himself countless times over the past few weeks, but the allure of invisibility always proved too strong to resist. Tonight, though, felt different. The weight of his recent actions, Samantha losing her job, the Millers' crumbling marriage, pressed heavily on his conscience. Alex shook his head, trying to dispel the guilt. He was here for a reason, to change his grades. It seemed trivial compared to his other escapades, but it was the original temptation that had led him down this path. If he could just do this one thing, maybe he could finally put the invisibility behind him. The lock on the side entrance yielded easily to his practiced touch. Alex slipped inside, the familiar smell of floor wax and chalk dust filling his nostrils. The empty hallways echoed with the ghosts of daytime clamour, now eerily silent. He made his way to the administrative office, his invisible fingers deftly picking the lock. The main computer hummed to life under his touch, its glow casting strange shadows in the darkened room. As Alex navigated through the school's system, a flicker of movement caught his eye. He froze, heart pounding. Had someone seen him? Impossible. He was invisible. But there it was again, a shimmer in the air, like heat waves rising from sun-baked asphalt. Alex looked down at his hands, and for a moment he could see the outline of his fingers against the keyboard. Panic seized him. Something was wrong with the device. He fumbled for the switch, his fingers trembling as they searched for the familiar button. Suddenly a jolt of electricity shot through his body. The invisibility device on his wrist sparked and sputtered, its surface growing hot against his skin. Alex cried out in pain and surprise, the sound echoing loudly in the empty office. The world around him began to warp and twist, colours bleeding into one another like a watercolour painting left out in the rain. Alex stumbled backwards, knocking over a chair in his panic. He reached out to steady himself against a filing cabinet, but his hand passed right through it. "No, no, no," he muttered, his voice sounding distant and hollow to his own ears. He tried to grab the edge of the desk, the computer mouse, anything, but his fingers slipped through every solid object as if they were made of mist. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't just invisible anymore. He was intangible. Terror clawed at his throat as he fled the office, his feet making no sound on the linoleum floors. He burst out of the school, the cool night air offering no relief to his incorporeal form. Alex ran all the way home, his mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a nightmare, some horrific dream brought on by guilt and fear. But as he phased through his own front door, untouched by the solid wood, the terrible truth sank in. He rushed to his parents' bedroom, desperation overriding any sense of propriety. "Mom! Dad!" he shouted, but his voice made no sound in the physical world. His father snored softly, oblivious to his son's presence. Alex reached out to shake his mother awake, but his hand passed right through her shoulder. He tried again and again, each attempt more frantic than the last, but it was useless. He was a ghost in his own home, unable to touch or be touched, to hear or be heard. As the first light of dawn crept through the windows, Alex sank to the floor, his incorporeal form racked with silent sobs. The invisibility device glinted on his wrist, now fused to his skin, a permanent reminder of his hubris. Hours passed, and Alex remained motionless, watching as his family stirred and began their day. His mother knocked on his bedroom door, calling his name. When there was no response, she peeked inside, her face creasing with worry at the empty, undisturbed bed. "John!" she called to his father, her voice tight with concern. "Alex isn't in his room." Alex watched, helpless, as panic slowly gripped his parents. Phone calls were made, friends questioned. By nightfall, the police were involved, and a search party had been organized. Days blurred into weeks. Alex followed his parents to police stations and interviews, watched as missing person posters with his face appeared around town. He saw the toll his disappearance took on his family, his mother's eyes constantly rimmed with red, his father's shoulders slumped with worry, Emily's sudden quietness. He stood by, an invisible spectre, as Sarah was questioned by the police. "I don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "He was just Alex, quiet, kind of shy. I never really noticed him much." The words stung, even now. As time passed, Alex began to understand the true nature of his punishment. He was condemned to watch, forever unseen, as life moved on without him. He saw his parents' worry turn to grief, saw Emily grow quieter and more withdrawn. He watched as the community's fear and suspicion, born from his invisible pranks, slowly faded into uneasy normalcy. Months after his disappearance, Alex stood in his own living room, watching as his parents sat with a grief counselor. "It's time to consider the possibility," the counselor said gently, "that Alex might not be coming home." The words hit Alex like a physical blow. He wanted to scream, to shake them, to make them understand that he was right there. But his cries were silent, his touch imperceptible. He was a ghost in his own life, forever separated from those he loved by an impenetrable barrier of his own making. As night fell, Alex phased through the walls of his home, drifting aimlessly through the quiet streets. He had become the ultimate observer, silently watching as the world moved on without him. The invisibility he had once craved had become his eternal prison, a fitting punishment for his reckless actions. He had wanted to be seen, to be noticed. Now, he would give anything to simply exist in the world he had taken for granted. But it was too late. Alex Thompson had truly disappeared, not just from sight, but from the very fabric of the world he once knew. The journey that had begun with a mischievous desire for attention had led him to the ultimate cruel form of invisibility. And as the stars twinkled indifferently overhead, Alex faced the terrifying reality of his new existence, forever unseen, unheard and unfelt, a cautionary tale in the dangers of unchecked power and the true meaning of isolation. Chapter 6. Echoes of the Unseen. The morning sun crept through the curtains of the Thompson household, its warm rays a stark contrast to the cold dread that had settled in Alex's non-existent stomach. He watched, helpless and silent, as his mother knocked on his bedroom door. "Alex, honey, it's time to get up for school," she called, her voice tinged with a hint of annoyance. When no response came, she pushed the door open, her expression shifting from irritation to confusion as she found the bed empty and undisturbed. "Robert," she called out, a note of panic creeping into her voice. "Alex isn't in his room." Alex tried desperately to reach out to her, to make any sort of contact, but his incorporeal form simply passed through everything he touched. "Mum, I'm right here," he shouted, his words echoing in a void that only he could hear. The house erupted into frantic activity. His father, Robert, rushed around, checking every room, while his mother, Lisa, called Alex's friends. With each passing minute, their worry grew more palpable. "He's never done this before," Lisa said, her voice trembling as she spoke to the police on the phone. "No, he didn't say anything about going anywhere. Please, you have to help us find him." Alex stood in the corner of the living room, watching his parents' world crumble around them. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, heavier than any physical burden he had ever borne. As the day progressed, the Thompsons' quiet suburban street transformed into a hub of activity. Police cars lined the curb, their lights casting eerie blue and red shadows across the manicured lawns. Neighbours gathered in small clusters, their hushed conversations a mix of concern and morbid curiosity. Officer Reeves arrived, his salt and pepper hair and piercing blue eyes conveying years of experience. He took charge of the investigation with a calm efficiency that seemed to momentarily steady Alex's panicking parents. "When was the last time you saw Alex?" Officer Reeves asked, his pen poised over a worn notebook. Lisa's voice quavered as she replied, "Last night at dinner. He seemed distant, but that's not unusual for a teenager, is it?" Reeves nodded, his expression neutral. "And his room? Anything out of place? Any signs of distress?" Robert shook his head. "Nothing. It's like he just vanished." The irony of his father's words wasn't lost on Alex. As Reeves continued his methodical questioning, Alex noticed a flicker of something in the detective's eyes. Doubt? Suspicion? He couldn't quite place it, but it made him uneasy. "I'll need to take a look at Alex's room," Reeves said finally. "And I'll need access to his computer, phone records, anything that might give us a clue." Alex followed the detective into his room, watching as Reeves's keen eyes scanned every surface. He paused at Alex's desk, picking up a crumpled piece of paper from the waste paper basket. Alex's heart sank. It was a failed math test he'd hidden from his parents, a reminder of the very reason he'd broken into the school. Reeves smoothed out the paper, his eyebrow raising slightly at the red F scrawled across the top. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson," Reeves called, his voice carefully neutral. "Did you know about this?" Alex watched as his parents' faces fell, guilt and confusion warring in their expressions. "No," Lisa whispered. "We had no idea." Reeves nodded, tucking the test into his notebook. "Sometimes," he said gently, "teenagers feel overwhelmed. They might do impulsive things." The implication hung heavy in the air. Alex wanted to scream, to tell them he hadn't run away, that he was right here. But his cries were lost in the void between worlds. As days turned into weeks, Alex witnessed the slow, painful process of a community grappling with his disappearance. He watched as his parents aged years in a matter of days, dark circles forming under their eyes, their movements heavy with exhaustion and grief. Emily, usually so vibrant and talkative, became withdrawn. Alex caught her one night, sitting on his bed, clutching his favorite sweatshirt to her chest. "Come back, you idiot," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "Who am I supposed to annoy now?" The invisible boy reached out, longing to comfort his sister, but his hand passed through her shoulder like mist. He had never felt more alone. At school, Alex's absence left a void that seemed to echo in the hallways. His locker became a makeshift memorial, covered in notes and photos. He watched as Sarah paused there each day, her fingers tracing the outline of a picture of him, her eyes filled with regret. "I should have noticed," she whispered one day, her words barely audible. "I should have seen you, Alex." Officer Reeves continued his investigation, his determination unwavering. Alex followed him to the police station, watching as the detective pored over reports, interviews and security footage. "There's something we're missing," Reeves muttered to himself one day, staring at the caseboard. His eyes lingered on a photo of the school, and Alex felt a chill run through his incorporeal form. How close was Reeves to discovering the truth? As weeks stretched into months, Alex witnessed the slow, painful process of the world moving on without him. His parents started to pack away his things, each item carefully wrapped as if preserving a precious memory. The search parties became less frequent, the posters with his face faded in the sun. Alex found himself adrift in a limbo of his own making, caught between the world of the living and something else entirely. He wandered the streets of his neighborhood, phasing through walls and witnessing the private moments of those he once knew. He saw the Millers struggling to rebuild their marriage, Mr. Miller sleeping on the couch most nights. He watched Samantha, the girl he had inadvertently gotten fired, finally landing a new job at the local diner. He observed Sarah slowly coming out of her shell, joining the art club and finding solace in her sketches. With each passing day, Alex grappled with the consequences of his actions and the true meaning of invisibility. He had craved attention, longed to be seen, and now he would give anything to simply exist in the world again. As the seasons changed and life continued its relentless march forward, Alex Thompson remained trapped in his invisible state, a silent observer of a world that was learning to live without him. The boy who had once felt unseen now understood the true weight of invisibility, and the responsibility that came with the power he had so recklessly wielded. In the quiet moments of the night, when the world slept and Alex's incorporeal form wandered the empty streets, he often found himself wondering, was this his punishment? Or was it a chance to learn the lesson he had so desperately needed? Only time would tell, and Alex had nothing but time stretching out before him in this unseen, untouchable existence. Chapter 7. The Invisible Observer. Seasons changed, leaves turned from green to gold to barren, and still Alex Thompson wandered the streets of his suburban neighborhood, an unseen spectre in a world that had begun to forget him. The chill of autumn gave way to winter's bite, but Alex felt neither cold nor warmth in his incorporeal state. He watched as his family struggled to find a new normal. His mother, once vibrant and quick to laugh, moved through the house like a ghost herself, her eyes often distant and unfocused. One morning Alex observed her pause at the doorway of his untouched room, her hand resting on the frame. "Lisa," his father called softly from downstairs. "We're going to be late for the support group." Alex followed them to a community centre where other parents of missing children gathered. The pain in the room was palpable, a shared ache that transcended words. As his parents shared their story, Alex longed to reach out, to tell them he was right there, but his voice remained unheard, his touch unfelt. At school, life continued its relentless march forward. Alex drifted through the hallways, an invisible audience to the daily dramas of teenage life. He watched as Sarah, his former crush, slowly emerged from the shell of grief she had retreated into after his disappearance. She joined the art club, and Alex often lingered in the classroom, admiring her sketches, many of which he noticed with a pang, were of him. One day he overheard a conversation between Sarah and her best friend Emma. "I never really knew him, you know," Sarah said, her voice tinged with regret. "I wish I'd taken the time." Emma squeezed her hand. "You couldn't have known, Sarah. None of us did." Alex felt a familiar ache in his chest. He had wanted so desperately to be seen, and now that he was truly invisible, people were finally noticing the space he had left behind. As winter deepened, Alex found himself drawn more and more to Officer Reeves. The detective hadn't given up on his case, even as other officers gently suggested it was time to move on. Alex watched as Reeves pored over files late into the night, his desk cluttered with coffee cups and scribbled notes. "There's something we're missing," Reeves muttered to himself one night, rubbing his tired eyes. "People don't just vanish." Alex wanted to laugh at the irony, but the sound died in his non-existent throat. He had vanished, in the most literal sense possible, and the weight of that reality pressed down on him with each passing day. As he wandered the quiet streets at night, Alex began to notice things he had never seen before. The old woman who lived at the end of the block, who everyone assumed was a recluse, sneaking out to leave food for stray cats. The teenage boy from 2 streets over, practicing dance moves in his garage when he thought no one was watching. The young couple who had just moved in, arguing in hushed tones about money troubles they hid behind cheerful smiles during the day. Alex realized that in becoming invisible, he had gained a unique perspective on the hidden lives of those around him. Everyone, it seemed, had their secrets, their struggles, their moments of quiet vulnerability. One night, unable to bear the stillness of his empty house, Alex found himself back at the abandoned laboratory where his journey into invisibility had begun. The place was just as he remembered it, dusty, forgotten, filled with the relics of experiments long abandoned. As he moved through the familiar rooms, a flicker of movement caught his eye. In a corner, barely visible in the dim moonlight filtering through a dirty window, stood a figure. For a moment, Alex's non-existent heart leapt. Could it be someone else like him? But as he drew closer, he realized it was just his own reflection in a cracked mirror, flickering in and out of visibility. Alex stared at his wavering image, seeing himself clearly for the first time since that fateful night. He looked different, older somehow, though he knew that was impossible. His eyes held a weariness that hadn't been there before, a knowledge of the world that came from seeing it unfiltered, unobserved. As he gazed at his reflection, Alex was struck by a sudden, profound realization. He had spent so much of his life feeling invisible, craving attention and recognition. Now, truly unseen, he understood the power and responsibility of being an observer. He had witnessed the raw, unguarded moments of people's lives, their joys, their sorrows, their secret hopes and fears. Perhaps, he thought, this was not just a punishment, but an opportunity to learn, to understand, to see the world and the people in it in a way few ever could. With this new perspective, he could find a way to make amends, to use his unique position to help others, even if they would never know it was him. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the laboratory windows, Alex made a decision. He couldn't change his situation, couldn't become visible again, but he could use this unique perspective to make a difference, no matter how small. He left the laboratory as the sun rose, casting long shadows across the suburban landscape. The world was waking up, people emerging from their homes to start another day. And Alex Thompson, the invisible observer, walked among them, seeing them, truly seeing them, in a way he never had before. As he phased through the front door of his house, hearing his mother's quiet sobs from the kitchen, Alex knew that his journey was far from over. But for the first time in months, he felt something other than despair. He felt purposeful. And in that sense of purpose, he found a small spark of hope. Alex may have been invisible to the world, but he was no longer invisible to himself. And with that realization, he took his first step towards redemption, ready to face whatever challenges his new existence might bring. Chapter 8. Unseen Reflections. The community centre hummed with subdued activity as people filed in, their faces etched with a mixture of grief and determination. Alex phased through the wall, his incorporeal form unnoticed by the gathering crowd. 6 months had passed since his disappearance, and the town had organised a memorial service. Alex watched as his parents entered, their hands clasped tightly together. His mother's eyes were red-rimmed, while his father's jaw was set in a rigid line. Emily trailed behind them, her usual vibrancy dimmed, clutching a framed photo of Alex to her chest. "Mum, Dad, Emily," Alex whispered, his words lost in the ether. "I'm right here." As people took their seats, Alex drifted to the front of the room, studying the faces he once knew. Mr. Patel from the convenience store, his eyes downcast. Samantha, the girl who'd lost her job because of Alex's theft, sat in the back, her expression a mix of sorrow and guilt. Even the Millers were there, their hands intertwined, seemingly having found their way back to each other through the shared grief of the community. Officer Reeves stood at the podium, his face haggard from months of fruitless investigation. "We're here today to remember Alex Thompson," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "While we haven't given up hope of finding him, we also want to celebrate the life of the young man we knew." As people stood to share their memories, Alex was struck by the impact he'd had on their lives, both good and bad. Mr. Patel spoke of Alex's politeness, how he always greeted him by name. Samantha, to Alex's surprise, talked about how Alex had once stood up for her against bullies at school. Sarah's turn came, and Alex felt a familiar ache as she approached the podium. "I didn't know Alex as well as I should have," she began, her voice trembling. "But in the months since he's been gone, I've learned so much about him from others. He was kind, funny, and saw people in a way most of us don't. I wish I'd taken the time to really see him when I had the chance." Alex's non-existent heart clenched. He had spent so much time wanting Sarah to notice him, and now that she had, it was too late. As the service continued, Alex was overwhelmed by the outpouring of emotion. People he had thought barely knew he existed shared stories of small kindnesses he'd forgotten, moments of connection he'd overlooked. It was a bittersweet revelation, to finally be seen, truly seen, only in his absence. His parents' words were the hardest to bear. His mother spoke of his laughter, how it could light up a room. His father, usually so stoic, broke down as he talked about teaching Alex to ride a bike. Emily, in a surprising moment of vulnerability, shared how Alex had always checked under her bed for monsters, no matter how much he teased her during the day. As the service drew to a close, Alex found himself standing before the photo display. Images of his life, birthdays, family vacations, silly selfies with friends, were arranged in a collage. In that moment, seeing his life laid out before him, Alex was struck by a profound realization. He had always felt invisible, overlooked, but the truth was, he had been seen all along. Every small interaction, every moment of kindness or mischief had left an imprint on the lives around him. He had mattered, not in the grand, attention-seeking ways he had craved, but in the quiet, everyday moments he had taken for granted. As people began to leave, Alex noticed Officer Reeves lingering by the display. The detective's eyes were fixed on a photo of Alex from the previous Christmas, his brow furrowed in thought. "What am I missing?" Reeves muttered, echoing the question that had haunted him for months. Alex wished he could provide an answer, to ease the burden of guilt he saw weighing on the officer's shoulders. But as he watched Reeves turn away with a heavy sigh, Alex understood that his disappearance had changed more than just his own existence. It had left an indelible mark on his community, altering the course of lives in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. As the last of the attendees filtered out, Alex remained, his invisible form a silent sentinel in the empty room. The weight of what he had witnessed settled over him like a shroud. He had wanted so desperately to be noticed, to stand out, and in the cruelest twist of irony, he had achieved that desire only in his absence. But amidst the sorrow and regret, a small spark of something else flickered within Alex. Understanding, perhaps, or the first glimmer of acceptance. He had been given a unique perspective, a chance to see the impact of his life and his absence with a clarity few ever achieved. As he phased through the wall and out into the fading afternoon light, Alex felt a sense of purpose stirring within him. He might be invisible to the world, but he was no longer invisible to himself. And in that realization, he found a new resolve. Alex Thompson, the unseen observer, walked among the living, carrying with him the weight of his past and a newfound determination to make a difference, however small, in the lives he now watched over. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the town, as Alex set out to face whatever challenges his spectral existence might bring, ready to learn, to grow, and perhaps in some unseen way to make amends.
Close your eyes, let your mind ignite. A universe of stories shine.